It was almost midnight when David finally saw the rest stop signs on the highway. He'd been driving for nearly 6 hours straight, and his eyes were getting heavy. The conference had drained every bit of energy from him, and all he wanted was to get home to his family. David was a federal judge, though you wouldn't know it by looking at him right now. He was wearing a simple polo shirt and jeans, his tie stuffed somewhere in his briefcase on the passenger seat. The conference had been important, sure, but grueling. 3 days of back-to-back sessions about criminal justice reform, late dinners with colleagues, and early morning meetings. He was done. He pulled his silver Honda into the rest stop parking lot. The place was quiet, just a few trucks parked in the distance and one other car near the restrooms. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that harsh yellowish glow that rest stops always seem to have. David parked, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a moment, letting the silence wash over him. His phone showed 3 missed calls from his wife, Patricia. He'd call her back in a minute, he thought. First, he needed to stretch his legs and maybe grab a coffee from the vending machine if they had one that actually worked. As David stepped out of his car, the cool night air hit his face. It felt good. He stretched his arms above his head, feeling his back crack in several places. Getting old, he thought with a slight smile. 47 wasn't ancient, but those long drives were getting harder every year. He was walking toward the restroom building when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel behind him. Headlights swept across the parking lot. David glanced back and saw a police cruiser pulling in, moving slowly, deliberately. He didn't think much of it at first. Cops patrolled rest stops all the time. Made sense, really, keeping travelers safe. But then the cruiser changed direction. Instead of parking near the building or continuing its patrol, it headed straight toward him. The headlights were bright, almost blinding, and David had to shield his eyes. The car stopped about 20 feet away and 2 officers got out. David could see them clearly now in the artificial light. Both were white men, probably in their 30s. One was stocky and broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut that reminded David of military types. The other was taller, leaner, with a mustache that looked like it belonged in an old Western movie. Both had their hands resting near their belts, near their weapons, and both were staring at him with expressions that made David's stomach tighten. He'd seen those looks before. He'd seen them in his courtroom on the faces of defendants who thought they were above the law. He'd seen them in news footage of traffic stops gone wrong. He'd hoped he'd never see them directed at him, but here they were. "Evening, officers," David said calmly, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "Just stopping for a quick break on my drive home." The stocky one, whose name tag read Barrett, didn't respond right away. He just looked David up and down, his eyes moving from David's face to his car and back again. The taller one, Collins, according to his badge, circled around to David's passenger side, peering through the windows. "Little late to be out, isn't it?" Barrett finally said. His voice was flat, suspicious. "Yes, sir, it is," David replied, keeping his tone respectful but not submissive. "I've been driving from a conference upstate, long day. Just need to use the restroom and maybe get some coffee." "Conference, huh?" Barrett's eyebrow went up. "What kind of conference?" David hesitated for just a second. Something told him that revealing he was a judge right now might not be the smartest move. These officers were already on edge, already suspicious, and sometimes people reacted badly when they felt challenged by someone they perceived as having more authority. "Legal conference," he said simply. "I work in the justice system." "Justice system," Barrett repeated, and there was something mocking in his tone. "That's so?" Collins had finished his inspection of the car and walked back around. "Nice car for someone just traveling through," he said. "Where'd you say you were coming from?" "The state legal conference in Brookfield," David answered. "I'm a resident of Richmond County, about 2 hours south of here." "License and registration," Barrett said, "and it wasn't a request." "Of course." David moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for his back pocket. "I'm getting my wallet now," he said, narrating his actions. He'd given this exact advice to countless people in his courtroom. Be calm, be clear. Make no sudden movements. He pulled out his wallet and extracted his driver's license, then leaned slightly toward his car. "Registration is in my glove compartment. I need to reach inside the vehicle to get it." "Go ahead," Collins said, but his hand moved closer to his weapon. David opened the passenger door and retrieved the registration from the glove box, along with his insurance card. He handed all 3 documents to Barrett, who examined them under his flashlight. The seconds ticked by. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine rumbled to life. The fluorescent lights continued their incessant buzzing. David kept his breathing steady, his face neutral even though his heart was beating faster now. "This your current address?" Barrett asked, tapping the license. "Yes, sir, it is." "And this vehicle is registered to you?" "Yes, sir." More silence. More staring. David could see Collins walking around his car again, bending down to look at the license plate, checking the tires, the windows, looking for any excuse, any reason to escalate this further. "Mr. Williams," Barrett said, pronouncing the name like it tasted bad. "You mind telling me what you're really doing out here at midnight?" David felt a flash of frustration but pushed it down. "As I said, officer, I'm driving home from a conference. I've been on the road for 6 hours. I'm tired. I stopped here to rest, use the facilities, and get some coffee." "That's all?" "That's all," Barrett repeated. He exchanged a glance with Collins and something passed between them. Some unspoken communication that David didn't like at all. "You know," Collins said, stepping closer, "we get a lot of suspicious activity at these rest stops. Drug deals, stolen vehicles, people running from warrants." "I understand that," David said evenly, "but I'm not involved in any of those things. You have my identification. You can run my license if you need to verify I'm telling the truth." "Oh, we will," Barrett said. "But first, I think we need to have a longer conversation about what you're really doing here." David looked from one officer to the other. The parking lot suddenly felt very isolated, very empty. His phone was in his pocket. His briefcase with all his credentials, his business cards identifying him as Judge David Williams, was sitting right there on his passenger seat, visible through the window. But these officers weren't looking at his briefcase. They weren't interested in who he really was. They'd already decided who they thought he was. And David knew from years of experience that changing someone's mind once they'd made that decision was nearly impossible. "Officers," he said carefully, "I'm happy to cooperate. But I'd like to know if I'm being detained, and if so, on what grounds." Barrett's face hardened. "You some kind of lawyer or something?" "I work in the legal field," David repeated. "Well, isn't that fancy?" Collins said with a sneer. "But out here, at midnight, at this rest stop, you're just another person we need to check out. So how about you stop with the legal talk and just answer our questions?" David stood there, the night air suddenly feeling colder, and realized this situation was about to get much worse before it got better. Barrett kept looking at David's license under his flashlight, tilting it this way and that like he was examining a counterfeit bill. Collins had walked back to their patrol car and was speaking into his radio, but David couldn't make out the words. The whole scene felt surreal, like something that happened to other people, not to federal judges on their way home from conferences. "This address," Barrett said again. "You said this is current?" "Yes, officer. That's my home address in Richmond County. I've lived there for 12 years. Barrett made a sound that might have been a laugh or a scoff. "Richmond County. That's a nice area. Expensive, big houses, nice lawns, good schools." He looked up at David with narrowed eyes. "What did you say you do again?" "I work in the justice system," David repeated for the third time. He was starting to feel like a broken record. "Yeah, you said that. But what exactly? You a paralegal? Court clerk?" The way Barrett said it made those jobs sound like insults. "I'd rather not discuss my employment at a rest stop at midnight," David said, trying to keep his voice level. "My identification is valid. My registration is current. My insurance is up to date. Unless you have reasonable suspicion that I've committed a crime, I'd appreciate getting my documents back so I can continue my journey home." That was apparently the wrong thing to say. Barrett's face went red. "You'd appreciate," he said, his voice rising. "You'd appreciate. Let me tell you something, pal. I don't care what you appreciate. We're conducting an investigation here, and you're going to stand there and answer our questions until we're satisfied. You got that?" David took a slow breath. He'd handled angry people before. His courtroom saw plenty of heated moments, plenty of raised voices. But this was different. In his courtroom, he wore the robe. He had the gavel. He had the authority. Here in this parking lot under these buzzing lights, he had nothing but his words and his dignity. Collins came back from the patrol car. "License is valid," he said to Barrett. "No warrants. Vehicle registration matches." David felt a small surge of relief. Maybe now they'd let him go. But Barrett just nodded slowly. "Uh-huh, that's interesting. Because that car," he pointed at David's Honda, That's a nice car. That's a $40,000 car, easy. And I'm wondering how someone who won't even tell us what he does for a living can afford a car like that. I bought it with money I earned, David said simply. It's 3 years old. I got it used. Used, huh? Barrett walked over to the car and ran his hand along the hood. Looks pretty new to me. Looks real well maintained. Almost too well maintained, if you know what I mean. David knew exactly what he meant, and anger flared in his chest. But he pushed it down, locked it away. Getting angry now would only make things worse. Officers, I understand you're doing your job. I respect that. But I've provided you with all the documentation you've asked for. Everything checks out. I haven't broken any laws. I'm simply trying to get home to my family. Your family, Collins said. What does your wife do? She help you pay for this nice car? The question was so inappropriate, so deliberately invasive, that David actually blinked in surprise. I don't see how that's relevant. I'll tell you what's relevant, Barrett cut in. He stepped closer to David, close enough that David could smell coffee on his breath. What's relevant is that we see a lot of people come through here. A lot of people who look like they've got money they shouldn't have. Cars that are too nice. Clothes that are too expensive. And when we start asking questions, they get defensive. Just like you're getting defensive right now. I'm not being defensive, David said quietly. I'm asserting my rights. Barrett's eyes went wide. Your rights? Your rights? He looked at Collins and laughed, an ugly sound. You hear this guy? He's talking about his rights. Where'd you learn about rights? TV? Some legal drama? I learned about rights in law school, David said before he could stop himself. The parking lot went very quiet. Law school, Barrett said slowly. So you're a lawyer? That's what all this is about. You're a lawyer who thinks he's smarter than us, thinks he can talk his way out of anything. I didn't say I was a lawyer, David said, realizing his mistake. I said I went to law school. A lot of people who work in the justice system have legal education, but it was too late. Barrett's expression had changed. The suspicion was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Something that looked almost like satisfaction, like he'd been waiting for David to say something, anything that would give him an excuse. Step away from the vehicle, Barrett ordered. Put your hands on the hood. David's heart sank. Officer, what's the reason for this search? The reason, Barrett said, is that I'm conducting an investigation, and I have reasonable suspicion that this vehicle may contain contraband. Now put your hands on the hood, or we'll put them there for you. What reasonable suspicion? David asked. What have I done that gives you reasonable suspicion? Don't make this harder than it has to be, Collins said, his hand now definitely on his weapon. Just do what he says. David looked around the parking lot. The other car that had been there was gone. The trucks were far away, their drivers probably asleep in their cabs. But there was a young couple walking toward the restroom building, and they'd stopped watching. The woman had her phone out. At least someone's recording this, David thought. He turned around slowly and placed his hands on the hood of his car. The metal was cool under his palms. He heard Barrett step up behind him, felt hands starting to pat him down, rougher than necessary, more aggressive than any legitimate search required. Spread your legs, Barrett commanded. David complied. So you're a lawyer, Barrett said as he patted down David's legs. Bet you think you're pretty important. Bet you think you're better than us cops out here doing the real work. I've never said anything like that, David replied. Don't need to say it. I can see it in your face, in the way you talk. All proper and educated. Barrett's hands moved to David's waist, checking his belt. Let me tell you something, lawyer. Out here, your degree doesn't mean a thing. Out here, we're in charge. Collins was searching through David's car now. David could hear him opening the glove compartment, rustling through the papers there, popping the center console. His briefcase. They were going through his briefcase. This is an illegal search, David said quietly. I haven't given you consent. You don't have probable cause. We've got all the cause we need, Barrett said. He stepped back. Turn around, David turned. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides. He was trying very hard to remain calm, to not let them see how angry he was, how humiliated he felt. The couple by the restroom was definitely filming now. David could see the phone's screen light in the darkness. Collins emerged from the car holding David's briefcase. Look at this, he said. Fancy leather briefcase. What's a guy need a briefcase for at midnight? I'm traveling from a conference, David said through gritted teeth. I already explained that. Collins opened the briefcase and started pulling things out. David's folders. his notes from the conference, his tablet, his business cards, David's business cards that said Judge David Williams, Federal District Court. But Collins wasn't reading them. He was just rifling through, making a mess, tossing things back in carelessly. The cards stayed in their holder, hidden in a side pocket. "Nothing here," Collins said to Barrett. "Car's clean too." Barrett looked disappointed. He stared at David for a long moment, and David could practically see him trying to think of what to do next. They'd searched him. They'd searched his car. They'd found nothing because there was nothing to find. "You know what I think?" Barrett said finally. "I think your attitude has been pretty poor this whole time. Pretty uncooperative. That's disorderly conduct in my book." David felt his blood run cold. "I've been nothing but cooperative. I've answered every question. I've submitted to your search even though it was illegal." "There's that lawyer talk again," Barrett said. "Always arguing. Always thinking you know better." He pulled out his handcuffs. "I think we need to continue this conversation at the station." "You're arresting me?" David couldn't keep the disbelief out of his voice. "On what charge?" "Disorderly conduct," Barrett said. "And resisting arrest." "I'm not resisting anything." "You're resisting right now," Collins said. Getting loud. Getting aggressive. David realized the trap he'd walked into. Any protest would be used as evidence of resistance. Any argument would be called disorderly conduct. They'd decided to arrest him, and nothing he said would change that. "Turn around," Barrett ordered. "Hands behind your back." For one brief moment, David considered refusing, considered pulling out his phone and calling anyone who could stop this insanity. But he knew what happened to people who resisted arrest, especially people who looked like him. He'd seen the videos. He'd read the reports. He'd presided over cases where simple traffic stops had ended in tragedy, so he turned around. He put his hands behind his back, and he felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click around his wrists, each click like the sound of a door slamming shut. The handcuffs were too tight. David could feel them digging into his wrists, cutting off circulation. He wanted to say something, to ask them to loosen the cuffs just a bit, but he knew better. Any complaint would be seen as more resistance, more attitude, more reason to rough him up. Barrett grabbed his arm, fingers pressing hard into his bicep. "Let's go," he said, pulling David toward the patrol car. David's mind was racing. This couldn't be happening. He was a federal judge. He'd sent criminals to prison, presided over complex cases, made decisions that affected people's lives. And now he was being arrested at a rest stop like a common criminal, by two officers who hadn't even bothered to really look at his identification, who'd decided who he was based on nothing but their own prejudices. "Wait," David said as they reached the patrol car. "What about my vehicle? My belongings?" "We'll have it towed," Collins said. He was already on his radio calling for a tow truck. "Towed? My car is legally parked. I haven't abandoned it. You can't just tow it." "We can and we will," Barrett said. "It's part of the arrest procedure. Don't worry, you can pick it up from the impound lot tomorrow. For a fee, of course." Of course, David thought bitterly. This just kept getting worse. Barrett opened the back door of the patrol car and put his hand on David's head, pushing him down into the seat. The movement was rougher than necessary, and David's shoulder hit the doorframe. He bit back a grunt of pain. The back seat of a police cruiser is designed to be uncomfortable. There's no way to get comfortable with your hands cuffed behind your back. David tried to lean forward, but the seatbelt was too tight. He tried to sit back, but the handcuffs dug into his spine. Finally, he settled for a half-twisted position that was only slightly less painful than the alternatives. Through the metal grate separating the back seat from the front, David could see Barrett and Collins getting into the car. They were talking to each other in low voices, occasionally laughing. Making jokes about him, probably. About the lawyer who thought he was too good to be arrested. About the guy with the nice car who should have just kept his mouth shut. The patrol car pulled out of the rest stop. David watched through the window as his Honda disappeared from view. Inside that car was his phone, his wallet, his briefcase with all his credentials. Everything that could have proven who he was, everything that could have stopped this nightmare before it started, was being left behind. "So," Barrett said, glancing at David through the rearview mirror, "you want to tell us what you were really doing at that rest stop?" David closed his eyes. "I already told you. Multiple times. I was driving home from a conference." Yeah, the conference. "Funny thing though, we called the conference center in Brookfield. They said their event ended yesterday afternoon. So what were you really doing? Meeting someone? Picking something up?" They'd called the conference center. They'd actually done some investigating. But they'd gotten the information wrong or misinterpreted it or simply didn't care about the truth. The main conference ended yesterday, David explained, trying to keep his voice calm. But there were optional sessions today. I attended those because they were relevant to my work. You can verify this. The conference has attendance records. Collins said. He didn't sound convinced. The ride to the county jail took about 15 minutes. 15 minutes of the worst discomfort David had ever experienced. His shoulders were screaming. His wrists were numb. And his mind kept cycling through the same thoughts. This isn't real. This can't be happening. How do I fix this? When they finally pulled into the jail parking lot, David felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because the painful ride was over. Dread because he was about to be processed into the jail system like any other criminal. Barrett pulled David out of the car, again rougher than necessary. They walked him through a back entrance, through a series of doors that buzzed and clanked, into a bright room that smelled of disinfectant and sweat. Got a live one for you, Barrett announced to the booking officer. A heavy-set woman with tired eyes who barely looked up from her computer. Name? She asked. David Williams. Barrett answered before David could speak. I can answer for myself, David said quietly. The booking officer finally looked at him. Address? David gave her his Richmond County address. Occupation? Here it was. The moment of truth. David could tell them right now, could say those two words that would end this whole situation, but he hesitated. Part of him wanted to wait, wanted to see how far they would take this, wanted them to realize their mistake on their own. Another part of him, the practical part, knew that was pride talking, and pride was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. I'm a federal judge, he said clearly. Barrett snorted. Yeah, and I'm the governor. Just put down unemployed. I'm not unemployed, David said, his voice rising slightly. I'm a federal district court judge. If you would just look at my business cards in my briefcase or call the federal courthouse in Richmond, you'd know that. The booking officer looked from David to Barrett and back again. Is he serious? He's been claiming to be a lawyer, a judge, all kinds of things, Collins said. Guy's delusional. I'm not delusional, David said, frustration finally breaking through his calm exterior. I am Judge David Williams. I was appointed to the federal bench 4 years ago. I have identification. I have credentials. If you would just verify— Enough, Barrett cut him off. Look, you can claim to be whoever you want. Judge, President, Superman, I don't care. Right now you're a suspect being booked on charges of disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. So just answer the questions and stop making this harder on yourself. The booking officer shrugged and typed something into her computer. David saw her enter unemployed under occupation. His jaw clenched. They took his fingerprints. Rolled each finger across the scanner, the ink smudging his skin. They took his mugshot, front view, side view, holding a number he'd never forget. They inventoried his belongings, which wasn't much since everything was still in his car. His watch, his belt, his shoes. They gave him orange scrubs and slip-on canvas shoes. You get one phone call, the booking officer said. Make it count, one phone call. David thought about who to call. A lawyer, but he was a lawyer. He knew the law better than most defense attorneys. The police? But they were the ones who arrested him. A colleague? But it was past 1 a.m. now, and most judges he knew wouldn't answer their phones at this hour. Patricia. He needed to call Patricia. They led him to a phone mounted on the wall. Barrett and Collins had finally left, probably to file their paperwork and high-five each other over their big arrest. David picked up the receiver with shaking hands and dialed his home number. It rang 4 times before Patricia answered, her voice thick with sleep. Hello? Patricia, it's me, David said. David? Where are you? I've been worried sick. You should have been home hours ago. David's voice caught. I'm at the county jail in Millbrook County. Silence on the other end. Then what, the jail? David, what are you talking about? I was arrested, he said. And saying the words out loud made them real in a way they hadn't been before. At a rest stop. 2 officers, they pulled me over, searched my car, and arrested me on false charges. False charges? David, this doesn't make any sense. Did you tell them who you are? I tried. They didn't believe me. They thought I was lying. He glanced at the clock on the wall. I have a bail hearing tomorrow morning. I'll explain everything then, but Patricia, I need you to know I'm okay. I'm not hurt. He stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. Just humiliated? Just angry? Just scared? I'm coming down there, Patricia said, fully awake now. I'll be there in 2 hours. No, David interrupted. Don't drive down here in the middle of the night. There's nothing you can do. I have to go through the system. Just stay home with the kids. I'll call you tomorrow after the hearing. David, I love you, he said. Tell Jason and Rachel I love them. I'll be home soon. He hung up before she could argue. Before he could hear the worry in her voice break into something more. Before he started thinking about what his kids would say when they found out their father had been arrested. A guard led him down another corridor, through more buzzing doors, into the holding area. It was a large cell with concrete walls and metal benches. About a dozen other men were scattered around the space. Some were sleeping. Some were staring at nothing. One was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. David found an empty spot on a bench and sat down. The concrete was cold through the thin scrubs. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. Tomorrow morning he'd appear before a judge. Not in his own courtroom, obviously, but in the county courthouse. Tomorrow morning this would all get sorted out. The charges would be dropped. He'd file a complaint against Barrett and Collins. He'd go home, shower off this nightmare, and try to forget it ever happened. But even as he thought it, David knew he wouldn't forget. Couldn't forget. Because this was what it felt like to be powerless. To be judged not by your actions or your character, but by how you looked. To have your words dismissed, your dignity stripped away, your rights violated. This was what countless people experienced every day. People who didn't have his education, his connections, his resources. People who didn't have a judicial robe waiting for them back home. The handcuffs were too tight. David could feel them digging into his wrists, cutting off circulation. He wanted to say something, to ask them to loosen the cuffs just a bit, but he knew better. Any complaint would be seen as more resistance, more attitude, more reason to rough him up. Barrett grabbed his arm, fingers pressing hard into his bicep. Let's go, he said, pulling David toward the patrol car. David's mind was racing. This couldn't be happening. He was a federal judge. He'd sent criminals to prison, presided over complex cases, made decisions that affected people's lives. And now he was being arrested at a rest stop like a common criminal by 2 officers who hadn't even bothered to really look at his identification, who'd decided who he was based on nothing but their own prejudices. Wait, David said as they reached the patrol car. What about my vehicle? My belongings? We'll have it towed, Collins said. He was already on his radio calling for a tow truck. Towed? My car is legally parked. I haven't abandoned it. You can't just tow it. We can and we will, Barrett said. It's part of the arrest procedure. Don't worry, you can pick it up from the impound lot tomorrow. For a fee, of course. Of course, David thought bitterly. This just kept getting worse. Barrett opened the back door of the patrol car and put his hand on David's head, pushing him down into the seat. The movement was rougher than necessary, and David's shoulder hit the doorframe. He bit back a grunt of pain. The back seat of a police cruiser is designed to be uncomfortable. There's no way to get comfortable with your hands cuffed behind your back. David tried to lean forward, but the seatbelt was too tight. He tried to sit back, but the handcuffs dug into his spine. Finally, he settled for a half-twisted position that was only slightly less painful than the alternatives. Through the metal grate separating the back seat from the front, David could see Barrett and Collins getting into the car. They were talking to each other in low voices, occasionally laughing. Making jokes about him, probably. About the lawyer who thought he was too good to be arrested. About the guy with the nice car who should have just kept his mouth shut. The patrol car pulled out of the rest stop. David watched through the window as his Honda disappeared from view. Inside that car was his phone, his wallet, his briefcase with all his credentials. Everything that could have proven who he was. Everything that could have stopped this nightmare before it started was being left behind. So, Barrett said, glancing at David through the rearview mirror, you want to tell us what you were really doing at that rest stop? David closed his eyes. I already told you. Multiple times. I was driving home from a conference. Yeah, the conference. Funny thing, though. We called the conference center in Brookfield. They said their event ended yesterday afternoon. So what were you really doing? Meeting someone? Picking something up? They'd called the conference center. They'd actually done some investigating, but they'd gotten the information wrong or misinterpreted it or simply didn't care about the truth. The main conference ended yesterday, David explained, trying to keep his voice calm. But there were optional sessions today. I attended those because they were relevant to my work. You can verify this. The conference has attendance records. Uh-huh, Colin said. He didn't sound convinced. The ride to the county jail took about 15 minutes. 15 minutes of the worst discomfort David had ever experienced. His shoulders were screaming. His wrists were numb. And his mind kept cycling through the same thoughts. This isn't real. This can't be happening. How do I fix this? When they finally pulled into the jail parking lot, David felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because the painful ride was over. Dread because he was about to be processed into the jail system like any other criminal. Barrett pulled David out of the car, again rougher than necessary. They walked him through a back entrance, through a series of doors that buzzed and clanked, into a bright room that smelled of disinfectant and sweat. Got a live one for you, Barrett announced to the booking officer, a heavy-set woman with tired eyes who barely looked up from her computer. Name? She asked. David Williams, Barrett answered before David could speak. I can answer for myself, David said quietly. The booking officer finally looked at him. Address? David gave her his Richmond County address. Occupation? Here it was. The moment of truth. David could tell them right now. Could say those two words that would end this whole situation. But he hesitated. Part of him wanted to wait. Wanted to see how far they would take this, wanted them to realize their mistake on their own. Another part of him, the practical part, knew that was pride talking. And pride was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. I'm a federal judge, he said clearly. Barrett snorted. Yeah, and I'm the governor. Just put down unemployed. I'm not unemployed, David said, his voice rising slightly. I'm a federal district court judge. If you would just look at my business cards in my briefcase or call the federal courthouse in Richmond, you'd know that. The booking officer looked from David to Barrett and back again. Is he serious? He's been claiming to be a lawyer, a judge, all kinds of things, Colin said. Guy's delusional. I'm not delusional, David said, frustration finally breaking through his calm exterior. I am Judge David Williams. I was appointed to the federal bench 4 years ago. I have identification. I have credentials. If you would just verify enough, Barrett cut him off. Look, you can claim to be whoever you want. Judge, President, Superman, I don't care. Right now, you're a suspect being booked on charges of disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. So just answer the questions and stop making this harder on yourself. The booking officer shrugged and typed something into her computer. David saw her enter unemployed under occupation. His jaw clenched. They took his fingerprints, rolled each finger across the scanner, the ink smudging his skin. They took his mugshot, front view, side view, holding a number he'd never forget. They inventoried his belongings, which wasn't much since everything was still in his car. His watch, his belt, his shoes. They gave him orange scrubs and slip-on canvas shoes. You get one phone call, the booking officer said. Make it count, one phone call. David thought about who to call. A lawyer. But he was a lawyer. He knew the law better than most defense attorneys. The police? But they were the ones who arrested him. A colleague? But it was past 1 in the morning now, and most judges he knew wouldn't answer their phones at this hour. Patricia. He needed to call Patricia. They led him to a phone mounted on the wall. Barrett and Collins had finally left, probably to file their paperwork and high-five each other over their big arrest. David picked up the receiver with shaking hands and dialed his home number. It rang 4 times before Patricia answered, her voice thick with sleep. Hello? Patricia, it's me, David said. David. Where are you? I've been worried sick. You should have been home hours ago. David's voice caught. I'm at the county jail in Millbrook County. Silence on the other end. Then what, the jail? David, what are you talking about? I was arrested, he said, and saying the words out loud made them real in a way they hadn't been before. At a rest stop. 2 officers, they pulled me over, searched my car, and arrested me on false charges. False charges? David, this doesn't make any sense. Did you tell them who you are? I tried. They didn't believe me. They thought I was lying. He glanced at the clock on the wall. I have a bail hearing tomorrow morning. I'll explain everything then. But Patricia, I need you to know I'm okay. I'm not hurt. I'm just... He stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. Just humiliated? Just angry? Just scared? I'm coming down there, Patricia said, fully awake now. I'll be there in 2 hours. No, David interrupted. Don't drive down here in the middle of the night. There's nothing you can do. I have to go through the system. Just stay home with the kids. I'll call you tomorrow after the hearing. David, I love you, he said. Tell Jason and Rachel I love them. I'll be home soon. He hung up before she could argue, before he could hear the worry in her voice break into something more. Before he started thinking about what his kids would say when they found out their father had been arrested. A guard led him down another corridor, through more buzzing doors, into the holding area. It was a large cell with concrete walls and metal benches. About a dozen other men were scattered around the space. Some were sleeping. Some were staring at nothing. One was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. David found an empty spot on a bench and sat down. The concrete was cold through the thin scrubs. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. Tomorrow. Tomorrow morning he'd appear before a judge. Not in his own courtroom, obviously, but in the county courthouse. Tomorrow morning this would all get sorted out. The charges would be dropped. He'd file a complaint against Barrett and Collins. He'd go home, shower off this nightmare, and try to forget it ever happened. But even as he thought it, David knew he wouldn't forget. Couldn't forget. Because this was what it felt like to be powerless. To be judged not by your actions or your character, but by how you looked. To have your words dismissed, your dignity stripped away, your rights violated. This was what countless people experienced every day. People who didn't have his education, his connections, his resources. People who didn't have a judicial robe waiting for them back home. The morning had started normally for Officers Barrett and Collins. They'd clocked in at 6, grabbed coffee from the station's break room, and spent the first hour of their shift doing paperwork. Barrett had hummed while filling out the arrest report from the night before. Collins had joked about the lawyer they'd picked up at the rest stop, making quotation marks with his fingers when he said the word lawyer. Guy probably watches too much television, Collins had said, grinning. Thinks knowing a few legal terms makes him smart. They always think they're smart, Barrett had agreed, until they're sitting in a cell. Then they realize who's really in charge. They'd filed their reports, checked their equipment, and headed out for their first patrol of the morning. At 9:30, they got a call to appear at the county courthouse. Standard procedure for an arrest made the night before. They'd need to be present in case the judge had questions, though that rarely happened. Most of these morning hearings were quick. Bail gets set, defendant gets released or sent back to holding, everyone moves on with their day. Barrett parked the cruiser in the courthouse lot. They walked through the metal detectors, nodded at the security guards they saw every week, and made their way to courtroom 3 where Judge Henderson presided. The courtroom was already busy. Lawyers chatted in hushed tones. Defendants sat in the gallery, some in street clothes, others still in jail scrubs. A clerk was organizing files at her desk. Everything looked normal, routine, just another morning in county court. Barrett and Collins took seats in the back row, the usual spot for officers waiting to be called. They'd probably be here for an hour or so, Barrett figured. Henderson ran her courtroom efficiently, but there were always delays. Lawyers asking for continuances. Defendants who didn't understand the process, the usual chaos of the justice system. Think the guy from last night is here yet? Collins whispered. Barrett shrugged. Probably. Henderson usually does the overnight arrests first. Get them processed and out of here. They settled in to wait. Barrett pulled out his phone and scrolled through social media. Collins leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes half closed. Around them, the courtroom slowly filled up. More lawyers. More defendants. A few people who looked like family members, worried faces scanning the room for their loved ones. At exactly 10 o'clock, a door behind the bench opened. All rise, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Linda Henderson presiding. Everyone stood. Judge Henderson entered, her black robe flowing behind her, and took her seat at the bench. She was in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Barrett had appeared before her dozens of times. She was tough but fair, asked good questions, didn't waste time. Please be seated, Henderson said. The courtroom rustled as everyone sat down. We have a full docket this morning, so let's move efficiently. Clerk, call the first case. The clerk checked her computer. Case number 2024 CR 8847. The State versus David Williams. Charges of disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. Barrett straightened up. That was their guy. He glanced at Collins, who was also paying attention now. A door to the side of the courtroom opened. A young woman in a suit emerged, probably a public defender, and behind her walked the man from the rest stop, David Williams. He was wearing the same clothes from last night, looking tired and rumpled, but his posture was straight, his expression calm. Barrett watched as Williams walked to the defense table. Good, he thought. Let's get this over with. Guy would probably get bail, pay his fine eventually, and learn a lesson about attitude with police officers. The public defender and Williams approached the bench. Judge Henderson was reading through a file, probably the arrest report Barrett had filed that morning. She looked up as they got closer. "Mr. Williams," Henderson said, "you're charged with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. How do you plead?" The public defender held up a hand. "Your Honor, before my client enters a plea, there's something the court needs to know." Henderson raised an eyebrow. Barrett could see her preparing for whatever excuse or explanation was about to come. He'd heard them all. "My client has a job. My client has kids. My client was having a bad day." None of it ever made much difference, but Henderson's expression suddenly changed. Her eyes widened. She leaned forward, staring at Williams like she was seeing him for the first time. "Judge Williams?" she said, and her voice was shocked, disbelieving. The courtroom went silent. Everyone sensed something unusual was happening. Barrett felt his stomach drop. "Judge Williams? What was Henderson talking about?" Williams nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm Judge David Williams, Federal District Court. I've been trying to explain that since last night, but the arresting officers didn't believe me." The words hit Barrett like a physical blow. Federal District Court, federal judge. The guy they'd arrested, the guy they'd searched and humiliated and thrown in a cell was a federal judge. No, that wasn't possible. Barrett's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The guy had been evasive. He'd refused to answer questions. He'd been alone at a rest stop at midnight, acting suspicious. He'd said he worked in the justice system, but lots of people said things like that. Lawyers, paralegals, court clerks, they all tried to sound important. But a federal judge? Barrett looked at Collins. Collins' face had gone pale, his mouth slightly open. They were both thinking the same thing. They'd screwed up. They'd screwed up badly. At the bench, Judge Henderson was still staring at Williams. "Judge Williams, I met you 2 years ago at the state legal conference. You gave a presentation on criminal justice reform." "I remember," Williams said. "You asked a question about sentencing guidelines." "I cannot believe..." Henderson stopped, took a breath, visibly collecting herself. "I cannot believe you were arrested and spent the night in our county jail. This is absolutely unacceptable." The public defender spoke up. "Your Honor, my client was stopped at a rest stop last night while traveling home from a conference. Officers Barrett and Collins conducted an illegal search of his person and vehicle without probable cause. When Judge Williams asserted his constitutional rights, they arrested him on false charges. He tried multiple times to identify himself, but the officers refused to believe him." Henderson's expression had shifted from shock to anger. Real anger. Barrett had seen her annoyed before, had seen her frustrated with incompetent lawyers or unruly defendants, but he'd never seen her look like this, like she was barely containing her fury. "Where are Officers Barrett and Collins?" Henderson asked, her voice sharp. Barrett felt every eye in the courtroom turn toward him. His legs felt weak as he stood up. "Here, Your Honor," he managed to say. His voice sounded strange, distant. "Approach the bench," Henderson ordered. It was a long walk from the back of the courtroom to the front. Barrett was aware of every step, every sound his shoes made on the tile floor. Collins walked beside him, and Barrett could hear his partner's breathing, quick and shallow. They stood before the bench. Barrett couldn't bring himself to look at Williams, who was standing just a few feet away at the defense table. Judge Henderson stared down at them. "Officers, is it true that you arrested Judge Williams last night at a rest stop?" "Yes, Your Honor," Barrett said. His mouth was dry. "But we didn't know he was a judge." "He didn't tell us, and he didn't tell you?" Henderson's voice could have cut glass. "According to this arrest report that you filed, Judge Williams identified himself multiple times as working in the legal system. According to statements from witnesses at the rest stop, Judge Williams remained calm and cooperative throughout the encounter. And according to his public defender, Judge Williams explicitly stated he was a judge, but you chose not to believe him. Your Honor, he was being evasive. Collins jumped in. He wouldn't answer our questions directly. He kept talking about his rights like he was trying to hide something. Talking about his rights? Henderson repeated. He was asserting his constitutional rights, which every American citizen is entitled to do, and which you, as police officers, are sworn to protect. Did you ask to see his identification? Yes, ma'am. He showed us his driver's license. Did you search his vehicle? Barrett and Collins exchanged glances. Yes, Your Honor, Barrett admitted. On what probable cause? The silence stretched out. Barrett scrambled for an answer, but everything he'd thought justified the search last night now seemed flimsy, ridiculous even. We had reasonable suspicion, he finally said. The subject was at a rest stop late at night, acting nervous. Acting nervous? Williams spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but firm. I wasn't acting nervous, Officer Barrett. I was tired. I had been driving for 6 hours. I stopped to use the restroom. That's not suspicious behavior. That's normal behavior. You seemed evasive, Barrett insisted, finally looking at Williams. You wouldn't tell us your occupation. I told you 3 times that I worked in the justice system, Williams said. I told you I'd attended a legal conference. I told you I went to law school. And when I was being booked at the jail, I explicitly said I was a federal judge. The booking officer can confirm that. But you told her I was delusional. You had her write down that I was unemployed. Henderson closed her eyes briefly, and Barrett knew she was trying to control her temper. When she opened them again, her gaze was steel. After Judge Henderson dismissed the courtroom, David stood at the defense table and took a deep breath. The adrenaline that had carried him through the last 12 hours was starting to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, but he couldn't rest yet. There was still work to do. Henderson gestured for him to approach the bench. Barrett and Collins stood a few feet away, looking like they wanted to sink through the floor. The bailiff, a large man named Rodriguez, whom David had noticed watching the proceedings with barely concealed shock, positioned himself near the officers. Judge Williams, Henderson began, her voice more gentle now that the courtroom was empty. I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Take your time. David organized his thoughts. After years of hearing testimony, evaluating evidence, and writing judicial opinions, he knew how to present facts clearly and chronologically. He started with the conference, his long drive home, his decision to stop at the rest stop. He described the moment the patrol car pulled in, the way the officers approached with their hands near their weapons, their immediate suspicion. They asked me what I was doing there, David said. I explained I was driving home, that I needed to rest. I was polite. I was cooperative, but I could see they'd already made assumptions about who I was and why I was there. He detailed the questions about his car, the insinuations that it was too nice for someone like him, the illegal search, the humiliation of being patted down in a public parking lot while strangers watched and recorded on their phones. When they searched my car, David continued, they went through my briefcase. My business cards were in there, cards that clearly identify me as a federal district court judge. But Officer Collins didn't look at them. He just rifled through everything and tossed it back. Barrett shifted uncomfortably. We were looking for contraband, not business cards. David turned to look at him directly. You weren't looking for anything specific, Officer Barrett. You were looking for an excuse to arrest me because I had the audacity to question your authority, because I knew my rights and wasn't afraid to assert them. That's not, Barrett started, but Henderson held up her hand. Let Judge Williams finish, she said. David described the arrest itself, the too tight handcuffs, the rough handling, the mocking comments about him thinking he was a lawyer, the ride to the jail where they'd called the conference center but either misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented the information they received. At booking, David said, I told them explicitly that I was a federal judge. The booking officer looked at Officer Barrett for confirmation. He told her I was delusional. She put down that I was unemployed. Henderson made a note on her legal pad. We'll need to pull the booking video. Every word of that conversation will be recorded. There's also body camera footage from the arrest, I assume, David added, and dash cam footage from the patrol car, plus the videos taken by bystanders at the rest stop. Multiple people were recording. Barrett and Collins exchanged worried glances. Body cameras. They'd forgotten about those. David continued with his account of the night in jail. The holding cell. The conversations with other inmates. The cold bench, the terrible breakfast, the growing realization that what he was experiencing, thousands of people experienced every day without his resources or his knowledge of the law. Your Honor, David said, I want to be clear about something. What happened to me last night was wrong. It was illegal. But I'm a federal judge. I'll walk out of here today. I'll go home to my family. I'll file complaints and lawsuits and people will listen because of who I am. But the young man I met in that cell, Tyler, who was arrested for missing a court date because he couldn't get off work, he doesn't have those options. The man who's been waiting 3 days for a public defender because he can't afford bail on a shoplifting charge he says he didn't commit, he'll keep waiting. The system failed me for one night. It fails people like them every single day. The courtroom was quiet. Henderson was nodding slowly, her expression thoughtful. Even Barrett and Collins seemed to recognize the truth in David's words, though they didn't look happy about it. Judge Williams, Henderson said, your point is well taken, and I want you to know that I take these issues seriously in my courtroom. But right now we need to address the immediate situation. You were subjected to an illegal arrest. You spent a night in jail. These officers violated your constitutional rights. What would you like to see happen? David had been thinking about this question all night. The easy answer would be to throw the book at Barrett and Collins. Get them fired, file criminal charges, sue them personally in the department, make an example of them so spectacular that no officer would ever dare to do something similar again. But David had also spent years thinking about criminal justice reform, about how punishment without rehabilitation just created more problems, about how the system needed to change from the top down and the bottom up. I want a full internal affairs investigation, David said. I want these officers suspended pending that investigation. I want all evidence preserved, body cameras, dash cameras, booking footage, everything. I want to review their personnel files to see if this is part of a pattern of behavior. Henderson nodded. Agreed. What else? I want the police department to implement mandatory training on constitutional rights. Not just a 1-hour seminar that everyone sleeps through. Real training, role-playing scenarios, testing, accountability. That seems reasonable, Henderson said. Though that's beyond my authority to order. You'd need to work with the police chief and the county commissioners. I intend to, David said. I also want Officer Barrett and Collins to undergo that training personally, if they hope to keep their jobs. And I want them to spend a day, just one day, as observers in this courthouse, sitting through bond hearings, watching what happens to the people they arrest, seeing the consequences of their actions beyond just writing a report and moving on. Barrett looked up at that, surprise in his expression. Whatever he'd been expecting, it apparently wasn't this. You don't want us fired? Collins asked quietly. David considered the question. What I want is for this to never happen again. Not to me, not to anyone. Firing you might feel satisfying, but it won't fix the underlying problems. It won't change the culture that made you think it was acceptable to treat me, or anyone, the way you treated me last night. But, David continued, his voice hardening, if the investigation shows this is part of a pattern, if I find out you've done this before to other people who didn't have the resources to fight back, if I discover you've been violating people's rights regularly and getting away with it because no one could challenge you, then yes, I'll push for termination, and criminal charges, and civil suits, and I will make sure everyone knows exactly what you did. The threat hung in the air. Barrett and Collins both looked down at their feet. Henderson made more notes. Bailiff Rodriguez, please collect these officers' badges and weapons. Officers, you're suspended with pay pending investigation. You're to have no contact with Judge Williams or any witnesses to last night's events. You'll be contacted by Internal Affairs within 48 hours. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, they said in unison. Rodriguez stepped forward. Barrett and Collins slowly removed their badges from their belts and their weapons from their holsters. Watching them surrender the symbols of their authority, David felt not satisfaction but sadness. These were men who'd been given power and had abused it, but they were also products of a system that had taught them, consciously or unconsciously, that some people deserved respect and others didn't. Judge Williams, Henderson said after Barrett and Collins had left the courtroom, escorted by Rodriguez, I want to apologize on behalf of the county. This should never have happened. You were visiting our jurisdiction, and instead of being treated with courtesy and respect, you were arrested and jailed. It's shameful. It's not your fault, Judge Henderson, David replied, but I appreciate the apology. And I hope we can work together to make sure the reforms I mentioned actually happen. You have my full support, Henderson said. I'll speak with the county commissioners today. I'll also reach out to the police chief. And Judge Williams, if you need any documentation from this courthouse, any records or video, just ask. We'll provide full cooperation. David thanked her and gathered his things. Lisa Chen, his public defender, was waiting outside the courtroom. She looked somewhat stunned. That was incredible, she said. The way you handled that. I've never seen anything like it. I just told the truth, David said. Sometimes the truth is powerful enough on its own. Still, Lisa said, most people in your position would have come in here with a team of lawyers and a lawsuit already drafted. You showed restraint and wisdom. That speech you gave about the system, about how it fails people every day, I think everyone in that courtroom needed to hear it. David smiled tiredly. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you for representing me this morning. You did an excellent job. It's an honor, she said. Seriously. And if you ever need anything, just call the public defender's office and ask for me. They exchanged contact information, and David finally walked out of the courthouse. The morning sun was bright, almost painfully so after the fluorescent lights of the jail and courtroom. The first news article appeared online 3 hours after David walked out of the courthouse. A local reporter had been in the courtroom that morning, covering routine cases when she witnessed the confrontation. Her article was short, factual, and explosive. Federal judge arrested at rest stop, charges dismissed in dramatic court hearing. By lunchtime, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets. By dinner, it was national. David's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. Legal analysts wanted comments. Fellow judges wanted to express their support. It was overwhelming. Patricia had driven him home, made him shower and eat, and then stationed herself as his personal secretary, screening calls and taking messages. Their kids, Jason and Rachel, both in college, had called immediately after seeing the news online. David had assured them he was fine, played down the severity of what happened, and promised to tell them the full story when they came home for the weekend. But by the second day, David realized he couldn't hide from this. The story was too big. The implications were too important. He needed to speak publicly but carefully, so he called a press conference, scheduled for the county courthouse steps, and prepared to tell his story to the world. The courthouse plaza was packed. Television cameras lined the steps. Reporters crowded forward with microphones and recorders. Members of the public stood in clusters, some holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "Judge Williams was right." David stepped up to the podium that had been set up for him. Patricia stood to his left, her hand on his back. Judge Henderson stood to his right, showing her support. Behind them were several other local judges, a representative from the ACLU, and the head of the county's chapter of the NAACP. The cameras clicked and flashed. David cleared his throat and began to speak. 3 nights ago, I was driving home from a legal conference. I was tired. I stopped at a rest stop to rest, use the restroom, and maybe get some coffee. That simple decision changed my life. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the crowd. I was approached by 2 police officers who immediately treated me with suspicion, not because I had done anything wrong, not because I was breaking any laws, but because of assumptions they made about who I was based on how I looked. I was searched without probable cause. I was arrested on false charges. I spent the night in jail. David saw people in the crowd nodding. Some had tears in their eyes. They knew this story because they'd lived versions of it themselves. I want to be clear about something, David continued. I am fortunate. I'm a federal judge. I have education, resources, and connections that most people don't have. When I walked into that courtroom yesterday morning, I had the power to fight back. The charges against me were dismissed. The officers were suspended. Justice in my case was swift. He gripped the edges of the podium. But I spent that night in jail with men who don't have my advantages. I met a young man who was arrested for missing a court date because he couldn't get off work. I met a man who'd been waiting 3 days for a public defender because he couldn't afford $500 for bail. These men, and thousands like them, experience what I experienced not for one night but for weeks, months, sometimes years. The plaza was silent except for the clicking of camera shutters. This isn't just about what happened to me. This is about a system that allows constitutional rights to be violated with impunity. This is about officers who abuse their authority, because they know most people can't fight back. This is about a culture that teaches some people they're automatically suspicious while others are automatically trusted. David looked directly into the cameras. I could use my position to focus solely on punishing the 2 officers who arrested me. I could file lawsuits. I could demand firings, and there may be a place for those actions. But what I really want is change. Real, meaningful, lasting change. He outlined his plans. Mandatory training for all law enforcement in the county on constitutional rights and implicit bias. A civilian review board to investigate complaints against police. Body camera footage to be automatically released in cases of disputed arrests. Regular audits of arrest records to identify patterns of discrimination. I'm also calling on my fellow judges, David said, both in this county and across the country, to examine how our courtrooms handle these cases. Are we too quick to believe police testimony over defendant testimony? Are we imposing excessive bail that keeps poor people locked up before they're even convicted? Are we treating everyone who appears before us with equal dignity and respect? He saw Judge Henderson nodding firmly. Some people will say I'm being too soft, that I should throw the book at the officers who arrested me, that I should make an example of them so severe that no officer would ever dare to do something similar again. But I've spent my career in the justice system, and I've learned that punishment without education, without understanding, without systemic change, just perpetuates the same problems. David took a breath. However, let me also be clear about this. If the investigation shows that Officers Barrett and Collins have a history of this behavior, if they've violated other people's rights and gotten away with it, then I will pursue every legal option available. Criminal charges, civil suits, professional sanctions, everything, because the badge is a symbol of public trust, and abusing that trust is one of the most serious violations an officer can commit. He was almost done now. His voice was getting hoarse and his exhaustion was catching up with him. Finally, I want to say something to everyone watching who has experienced what I experienced. Everyone who's been stopped unfairly, searched illegally, arrested wrongfully. Everyone who's been made to feel like their rights don't matter. I see you, I believe you, and I'm going to use whatever power I have to fight for you. The crowd erupted in applause. David stepped back from the podium, feeling Patricia's hand squeeze his. The questions from reporters came fast and furious, but he'd said what he needed to say. The rest could wait. Over the following week, the story continued to dominate headlines. The videos from the rest stop surfaced online, showing exactly what David had described. The body camera footage was released, contradicting several claims in Barrett and Collins's arrest report. The booking video showed David clearly identifying himself as a judge, and the officers dismissing him as delusional. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on David's side, but there were dissenters. Some police unions issued statements defending Barrett and Collins, claiming they'd followed proper procedures. Some conservative commentators suggested David was overreacting, that he should have simply shown his judicial credentials, and none of this would have happened. David responded to these criticisms calmly. He pointed out that he shouldn't have to prove he was a judge to be treated with basic respect and constitutional rights. He noted that the videos clearly showed he'd identified himself multiple times. And he emphasized that his judicial position was irrelevant to the fundamental question of whether the arrest was legal. The internal affairs investigation moved quickly. Investigators interviewed witnesses from the rest stop. They reviewed all the video evidence. They examined Barrett and Collins's personnel files and discovered this wasn't their first questionable arrest. Over the past 3 years, they'd accumulated 17 complaints from citizens, though none had resulted in serious discipline. The most damning discovery came when investigators found that Barrett had attended a training seminar 5 years earlier specifically about constitutional rights during traffic stops. He'd passed the test at the end. He knew the law. He'd simply chosen to ignore it. 2 weeks after David's arrest, the police chief held his own press conference. Barrett and Collins were being terminated. Criminal charges were being filed for filing false reports and violating civil rights. The department was implementing all of David's suggested reforms and going even further, creating a new internal affairs unit with more independence and authority. "We failed Judge Williams," the chief said, his expression grim. "We failed the community. These officers betrayed the trust we place in every person who wears a badge. That's unacceptable, and we're committed to making sure it never happens again." David watched the press conference from his chambers at the federal courthouse. He'd taken a week off as the chief judge had insisted, but he was back now, hearing cases, writing opinions, doing the work he loved. But something had shifted in how he approached that work. He paid more attention now to bail arguments. He asked more questions when police testimony seemed inconsistent with other evidence. He took longer with sentencing, considering not just the crime but the circumstances that led to it. And he made sure that everyone who appeared in his courtroom, whether they were a corporate lawyer or a homeless defendant, was treated with the same respect and dignity. His law clerks noticed the change. One of them, a sharp young woman named Angela who'd been with him for 2 years, commented on it one afternoon as they reviewed briefs. "Judge, can I ask you something personal?" David looked up from the document he was reading. "Of course. You've always been fair," Angela said. "That's why I wanted to clerk for you. But since the arrest, you've been different, more engaged with the human side of cases, more willing to question the government's narrative. Is that because of what happened to you?" 6 months had passed since that night at the rest stop. David drove past the same rest stop now on his way back from another conference, this one about implementing criminal justice reforms at the state level. He'd been the keynote speaker, sharing his story and the lessons learned from it. As he passed the familiar exit, he slowed down but didn't stop. Some memories were better left in the rearview mirror. The county had undergone remarkable changes in those 6 months. The reforms David had pushed for were now fully implemented. Every officer in the department had completed the constitutional rights training. The Civilian Review Board was operational and already investigating several complaints. Body camera footage was being released proactively in disputed cases, and perhaps most importantly, the culture within the department was shifting. The new police chief, brought in after the previous chief retired under pressure, had made accountability and community trust her top priorities. She'd instituted monthly town halls where citizens could voice concerns directly to police leadership. She'd created a new unit focused on de-escalation and community policing, and she'd made it clear that officers who violated constitutional rights would face serious consequences. The results were already visible in the statistics. Arrests for minor offenses were down 35%. Use of force incidents had dropped by 40%. Citizen complaints were down, but more importantly, the complaints that were filed were being investigated thoroughly and taken seriously. The community was beginning to trust their police department again. David had monitored these changes closely, meeting regularly with the police chief, the county commissioners, and community leaders. He'd also stayed in touch with Judge Henderson, who had become an ally in pushing for broader reforms within the court system. But perhaps the most significant change had come in David's own courtroom. His experience had fundamentally altered how he approached his work as a judge. He was more skeptical of police testimony that wasn't supported by video evidence. He asked more questions about probable cause and reasonable suspicion. He took bail arguments more seriously, particularly when defendants couldn't afford even small amounts. His law clerks had nicknamed him Judge Second Look, because he insisted on examining every assumption, every piece of evidence, every claim with fresh eyes. Some prosecutors grumbled that he'd become too defense-friendly, but defense attorneys praised him for holding the government to its burden of proof and protecting constitutional rights. David didn't care about the criticism. He knew what he was doing was right. He was simply being the judge he should have been all along, the judge he would have wanted presiding over his case if he'd been a regular citizen, without resources or connections. On a Thursday morning in late spring, David was reviewing case files in his chambers when his assistant buzzed through. "Judge, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important. His name is Tyler Johnson." David sat up straight. "Tyler, the young man from the holding cell. Send him in," David said immediately. A moment later, Tyler walked through the door. He looked different than he had that night. Cleaner, better rested, wearing a button-down shirt and khakis. But his eyes were the same, sharp and observant. "Judge Williams," Tyler said, extending his hand. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment." "Tyler, of course," David said, shaking his hand warmly. "Please sit down. How have you been?" Tyler settled into one of the leather chairs across from David's desk. "I've been good, actually. Really good. My case got dismissed like I texted you about. I found a new job, better than the one I lost. And I've been following what you've been doing, all the changes you've pushed for. It's amazing. I'm glad things are working out for you, David said sincerely, but I suspect you didn't come here just to give me an update. What can I do for you? Tyler nodded. You're right. I came because I want to help. I've been thinking a lot about that night we met, about what you said in your press conference about fighting for people like me. And I realized I don't want to just be someone who benefits from the changes. I want to be part of making those changes. That's admirable, David said. What did you have in mind? I want to go to law school, Tyler said, and there was determination in his voice. I want to become a lawyer, maybe eventually a public defender or a civil rights attorney. I want to help people navigate the system the way someone should have helped me. David felt a surge of emotion. This was exactly the kind of ripple effect he'd hoped his story might create. Tyler, that's wonderful. Have you taken the LSAT yet? Not yet, but I'm studying for it. I'm planning to take it this fall. The thing is, I don't have much money saved. Law school is expensive, and I don't have a college degree yet, just some community college credits, so I know it's going to be a long road. But you're committed to walking that road, David said. I am. Completely. That night in jail, talking to you, seeing how you handled everything with dignity and knowledge, that showed me what I want to do with my life. I want to be the person in the courtroom who actually understands what people are going through because I've been there. David leaned back in his chair thinking, Tyler, I have some connections in legal education. Let me make some calls. There are scholarships available for people pursuing law with the intention of doing public interest work. And there are programs that help people without traditional backgrounds get into law school. I'd be happy to write you a letter of recommendation when the time comes. Tyler's eyes widened. You'd do that? But you barely know me. We only met for one night. Sometimes one night is enough, David said. I saw your character that night, Tyler. You were facing your own problems, but you still took the time to talk to me, to challenge me to remember what I'd experienced. That showed me who you are. Besides, I believe in investing in people who want to make the system better. That's how real change happens. They talked for another 30 minutes. David gave Tyler contact information for several pre-law programs and scholarship opportunities. He explained the law school application process and offered to introduce Tyler to some public defenders and civil rights attorneys who could mentor him. By the time Tyler left, he had a folder full of information and a plan for his future. After Tyler left, David sat at his desk thinking about paths and purposes. 6 months ago, he'd been arrested at a rest stop, and it had seemed like the worst night of his life. But that night had led to this moment, to Tyler's decision to pursue law, to all the reforms that were making the system more just. Sometimes the worst experiences led to the most meaningful changes. His phone rang. It was the office of Senator Patricia Morrison, calling to invite him to testify before a congressional committee about police accountability and criminal justice reform. David accepted, adding it to his growing list of speaking engagements and advisory positions. That afternoon, David had a full docket of criminal cases. Among them was a bail hearing for a man arrested for shoplifting. The man, Thomas Rivera, was 52 years old, had no prior criminal record, and was accused of stealing food from a grocery store. The prosecutor was asking for $5,000 bail. David reviewed the file carefully. Rivera had lived at the same address for 15 years. He had a job, though it was low-wage work at a warehouse. He had family in the area. In short, he was exactly the kind of person who didn't need bail to ensure he'd return to court. Mr. Rivera, David said, I see you're accused of shoplifting items worth approximately $40. Is that correct? Rivera, who looked exhausted and defeated, nodded. Yes, sir. Your Honor, I was just trying to get food. My hours got cut at work and my kids were hungry. I know it was wrong. I'm sorry. The prosecutor started to argue for bail, citing the need to take all property crimes seriously, but David held up his hand. Counselor, this man has strong community ties and no criminal history. He's accused of a misdemeanor theft of minimal value. There's no indication he's a flight risk or a danger to the community. I'm releasing him on his own recognizance. The prosecutor looked surprised but didn't argue. Rivera looked like he might cry with relief. Mr. Rivera, David continued, you're being released today. You'll have a court date in 4 weeks. I expect you to be here. But I'm also going to have my staff give you information about food assistance programs and other resources that might help you. No one should have to steal food to feed their children. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. Rivera said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Thank you so much. As Rivera left the courtroom, David saw his assistant making notes about resources to provide. This was the kind of practical help the system should have been offering all along. It was a small thing, but small things added up. The rest of the day proceeded similarly. David was firm when necessary, but always thoughtful about the real-world impact of his decisions. He asked questions that got at the heart of what was really happening in people's lives. He treated every person with respect, whether they were a defendant or an attorney or a witness. That evening, as David drove home, he thought about the journey of the past 6 months. He'd become a public figure in a way he'd never intended. His face had been on national news. He'd given dozens of interviews. He'd spoken at conferences and advised policymakers.